Picture yourself in a basement archive beneath the British Museum. The air is cool, controlled, preserving. Rows of metal shelving stretch into shadow, each shelf bearing artifacts that shouldn't exist. Clay tablets pressed with marks that predate the pyramids. Stone seals depicting beings that walked before history began recording. And in one humidity-controlled case, a fragment no larger than your palm. Catalogue number K3473. Excavated from Nineveh in 1849. Translated reluctantly over the following decades. A fragment that contains a statement so unsettling that most scholars choose to interpret it as mythology rather than documentation. It describes a council, a gathering of beings called the Anunnaki. And in this council, they made a decision that would reshape everything. They decided to limit human lifespans, to introduce mortality where immortality had been, to ensure that humanity could never again rise to the heights it had reached before the waters came. This isn't from a fantasy novel. This is from the Epic of Atrahasis, one of the oldest written narratives ever discovered, preserved in Akkadian cuneiform, copied from Sumerian sources that predate Babylon itself. And if you read it carefully, if you set aside assumptions about what ancient people could and couldn't know, it reads less like myth and more like documentation of an agreement reached after catastrophe. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and your thoughts begin their evening descent, we're going to explore a possibility that archaeology whispers but rarely speaks aloud. That human civilization is not 5,000 years old, that the Sumerians were not the first, that beneath the oldest cities we've excavated lie the remains of older cities still, that we are not the beginning of something, but the continuation of a pattern that has repeated 6 times before us. We are, by this reckoning, the 7th civilization, and the evidence for the first 6 is written in clay, encoded in myth, and buried beneath meters of flood sediment that geology confirms but history struggles to explain. Before we descend into deep time, if you're drawn to histories that question the boundaries of the accepted timeline, a gentle like helps others find these late-night explorations. And I'm curious, where in the world are you tonight? What hour watches over your wandering? Let me know in the comments. The journey we're about to take spans not centuries but cycles, not dynasties but ages of the world. Let the boundaries of waking thought grow soft. What follows requires a different kind of attention. Now, let us begin where all such journeys must begin, with the oldest words ever written, with tablets pressed in Mesopotamian mud 4,000 years ago, with a list of kings that makes absolutely no sense unless it's telling us something true about a past we've forgotten how to remember. The Well-Blundell Prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It's small, surprisingly so, about 8 inches tall, a 4-sided clay prism covered entirely in cuneiform script, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, discovered in the ruins of Nippur, copied from sources the scribe himself described as ancient beyond reckoning. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it begins with a statement that should make every historian pause. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not kingship began, not kingship was invented, descended from heaven. As if rulership itself, the very concept of organized human governance, came from somewhere else, somewhere above, somewhere outside the human sphere. Then it names the first king, Alulim, and it records his reign. 28,800 years. The second king, Alulgar. 36,000 years, 8 kings total, ruling from 5 different cities, their combined reign spanning 241,200 years. Then, abruptly, the text pivots. Then the flood swept over. Everything changes after that line. Kingship descends from heaven again, but now it lands in Kish, a different city. And the kings who follow rule for shorter periods, still impossibly long by modern standards. 1,200 years, 900 years, but nothing like the antediluvian rulers. As the list continues through more dynasties, the reign lengths continue to decrease. By the time it reaches kings whose existence can be verified through independent archaeological evidence, kings whose inscriptions survive, whose cities have been excavated, the numbers have normalized. 23 years, 36 years, human lifespans. It reads like a civilization slowly forgetting how to live forever. Or more precisely, like a document attempting to preserve memory of a time when the rules were different. when lifespans measured in different units, when kingship itself operated under principles we no longer understand. For over a century, scholars have dismissed the antediluvian section as pure mythology. The numbers are impossible, therefore symbolic. The pre-flood kings represent cosmic ages, not historical individuals. The list becomes history only after the flood, when the numbers become plausible. But this interpretation requires something uncomfortable. It requires believing that ancient scribes, meticulous in their record-keeping, precise in their astronomical observations, sophisticated in their mathematics, suddenly abandoned all rigour when discussing their own origins. That they deliberately encoded fantasy in the same format they used for legitimate administrative records. There's another way to read it. Not as biography, but as chronology. Not as individual lifespans, but as epochs compressed into symbolic rulers. Each antediluvian king representing not a person, but an entire civilization, an entire age of the world. Elulim's 28,800-year reign becomes the first civilization, the founding age, the emergence from hunter-gatherer bands into something, organized, settled, capable of building in stone and tracking the stars. Al-Algar's 36,000 years becomes the second civilization, building on what came before, rising higher, developing agriculture, metallurgy, the first mathematics. Through 8 such ages, each one building on the ruins of the last, each one rising higher until catastrophe struck, until the flood swept over, until the chain of transmission broke, and then came the rebuilding, the 7th civilization. Us, the Sumerians, the ones who picked up the fragments and tried to remember what had been lost. This interpretation, while speculative, unlocks something remarkable. Because if you read the King List this way, as a chronicle of civilizational cycles rather than individual rulers, it suddenly matches patterns found in traditions across the ancient world. Traditions that had no contact with Sumer, no way of borrowing stories across oceans and language barriers. The Hindu texts describe 4 yugas, 4 great ages through which the world cycles endlessly. The Satya Yuga, when humans live for thousands of years in perfect harmony with cosmic law. The Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, still peaceful but declining. The Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age marked by growing conflict. And the Kali Yuga, our current age, the Age of Darkness, where lifespans are short and wisdom has faded. The structure is identical to the Sumerian King List. Long ages before catastrophe, progressive decline afterward. The world divided into before and after, with the after always diminished from what came before. The ancient Greeks preserved the same pattern. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, described 5 ages of man. The Golden Age, when humans lived like gods. The Silver Age, still blessed but less wise. The Bronze Age, violent and warlike. The Heroic Age, the time of great heroes. And finally, the Iron Age, his own present, characterized by endless labor and moral decay. Hesiod looked backward with longing, not forward with hope. He wished he had been born in an earlier time. The past was golden, the present was iron, the trajectory was decline. In Norse mythology, the cosmos operates in cycles of destruction and rebirth through Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The world burns, floods, freezes. Then from the ashes a new world emerges. The cycle continues. The Aztecs and Mayans both preserved elaborate calendars tracking vast cycles of time. The Aztec 5 suns, each representing a different world age, each ending in catastrophic destruction. The Mayan long count, measuring cycles within cycles within cycles. The Baktun lasting 5,125 years. The Pictun lasting 79,200 years. They were thinking in deep time, in ages beyond anything modern civilization considers. Why would cultures separated by oceans and millennia all tell the same essential story? That there were ages before this one, long ages, golden ages, ages when humans lived differently, knew more, understood principles we've forgotten. Then came catastrophe, flood, fire, darkness. The world reset, and we began again, smaller, younger, with fragments of what came before. The standard explanation is convergent evolution of myth. Humans everywhere experience natural disasters. We all fear death and decline. So we project these universal experiences onto cosmic timescales, creating myths that comfort us with patterns. But this explanation struggles against the specificity, the precise ratios in the Hindu yugas, the exact reign lengths in the Sumerian King List, the detailed descriptions of life in earlier ages. These aren't vague once-upon-a-time stories. They contain structure, mathematics, names, chronologies. What if they're memories? Not perfect memories. Not literal histories in the way we write history now, but cultural memories transmitted through oral tradition for so long that the stories became mythologized. The numbers became sacred. The events became divine interventions rather than natural processes. But beneath the mythology, a core of truth. There were civilizations before the ones we know, and they ended. Let your breathing slow. Let these patterns wash over you like water. Whether you believe any of this doesn't matter yet. What matters is the door opening. The possibility emerging. That history extends deeper than we've been taught. The geological record supports the possibility. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the world experienced dramatic climate change. Massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe melted rapidly. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines where humans had lived for millennia were submerged beneath expanding oceans. This event, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred relatively quickly in geological terms, over a few centuries, for people living through it, watching their villages swallowed by rising water, watching their hunting. Grounds transformed into seas, it would have felt like the end of the world. If there had been coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, and coastlines provide optimal resources for early human settlement, they would have been destroyed. Their remains now hundreds of feet underwater, largely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. We know humans have been anatomically modern for at least 200,000 years, behaviourally modern for perhaps 50 to 70,000 years. That's 50,000 years of humans just as intelligent as we are, just as capable of innovation, living and dying and building. And we have solid archaeological evidence for what? The last 10,000 years, the rise of agriculture, the first cities in summer, the early dynasties of Egypt. That leaves 40,000 years unaccounted for. What were humans doing all that time? The standard narrative says not much. Hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands, living hand-to-mouth, leaving behind cave paintings, and stone tools but no cities, no writing, no complex civilization. But what if some of them did build? Not global empires but regional cultures, trade networks, astronomical knowledge, sophisticated oral traditions. What if they built along Ice Age coastlines and were simply erased when the ice melted? We would have no way of finding them. The ocean doesn't preserve architecture. Stone foundations break apart. Organic materials decay. After 12,000 years underwater, even monumental structures would be reduced to ambiguous formations that look like natural geology. But there are hints, anomalies that don't fit the accepted timeline. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone temples built around 9500 BCE, featuring carved pillars weighing over 15 tons each, sophisticated astronomical alignments, evidence of large-scale social organization, built by people who are primarily hunter-gatherers. The sophistication challenges everything we thought we knew about the linear, progression from simple to complex societies. The temples were deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. Someone went to enormous effort to cover these structures with thousands of tons of dirt. Why? To preserve them, to hide them, to mark the end of something. Gunung Padang in Indonesia. A massive terrace structure that some researchers argue contains megalithic chambers dating back possibly 20,000 years based on geological surveys. Mainstream archaeology disputes this, dating visible construction to around 5000 BCE. But the deeper layers remain contested. What lies beneath? The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Underwater stone structures featuring right angles, terraces, and what appear to be deliberate cuts. Most geologists argue these are natural formations shaped by erosion, but some researchers interpret certain features as potentially artificial. If any portion proves human-made, it would have been constructed during the last ice age when sea levels were lower. These anomalies exist in the margins, dismissed or explained away by mainstream archaeology, perhaps correctly. The point is not that these sites definitively prove advanced Ice Age civilizations. The point is that the possibility exists, the door is open, and ancient cultures around the world seem to be telling us the door should be open. They're telling us, look backward, dig deeper. What you think is the beginning is not the beginning. If you're still with me, wonderful. If you've drifted, that's perfect too. Let the ideas move through you like wind through ruins. This is for those who sense that beneath the official story, something older waits. Now let's return to that clay prism in Oxford. Let's take those antediluvian kings seriously, not as literal individuals, but as what they might actually represent. 6 complete cycles of civilization before the 7th. First civilization. The age of Alulim. 28,800 years. This represents the first emergence of organized human society. The slow, painful transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled communities. The domestication of the first plants. The taming of the first animals. The recognition that staying in one place, building permanent structures, storing food for winter, this was possible. Archaeological evidence suggests this process began around 10,000 BCE in multiple locations. The Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, northern China, Mesoamerica. Independently, humans in different regions made the same revolutionary discovery: agriculture. But what if it wasn't the first time? What if this knowledge had been discovered before, lost in some earlier catastrophe, and was being rediscovered? The Sumerians themselves claimed their agricultural knowledge was taught to them by the Anunnaki, given, not discovered. Alulim's age, the first civilization, might represent the first time humans successfully made the agricultural transition, built the first permanent settlements, created the first social hierarchies necessary for complex societies. This process took thousands of years, compressed in the King List into the reign of one archetypal ruler. Second civilization, the age of Alalgar, 36,000 years. Building on the agricultural foundation, this age saw the development of true villages becoming towns, the first specialized labor, potters, weavers, toolmakers, the beginning of trade networks, the discovery of copper, then bronze. Evidence for this stage exists in places like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, occupied from 7100 to 5700 BCE, a dense settlement of mud brick houses, elaborate art, evidence of trade goods from hundreds of miles away. Not quite a city, but more than a village, a transitional form. Third civilization, the age of Enmenluana, 43,200 years. This age saw the first true cities emerge: walls, temples, central administration, the invention of writing to track trade and taxation, the development of mathematics, astronomy, law codes. This is what we think of as the beginning, the Sumerian emergence around 3500 BCE. But what if Sumer itself was built on older foundations? What if the sophistication that appears so suddenly in the archaeological record isn't new development but recovered knowledge? 4th, 5th, and 6th civilizations. 3 more cycles, each one rising to different heights, each one falling for different reasons: climate change, disease, war, resource depletion, internal collapse. By this reading, the antediluvian section of the King List doesn't describe 8 individual rulers. It describes 6 complete civilizations, with the final 2 kings perhaps representing transitional periods or overlapping cultures. And then came the flood. Not one flood, but the culmination of catastrophes that destroyed the 6th civilization so completely that when humanity rebuilt, they had to start almost from scratch, with fragments, with memories, with myths about how things used to be. The 7th civilization, us, beginning with Sumer, rising through Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution. Building higher than any civilization before, because we're standing on the shoulders of 6 previous cycles, each one passing forward fragments of knowledge that we've slowly reassembled. This interpretation transforms the King List from impossible mythology into compressed history, a chronicle of deep time, an attempt by ancient scribes to preserve awareness that we are not the first, that this has happened before, that the pattern repeats. Is this what the Sumerians actually meant? We can't know with certainty. They left no commentary explaining their own text. But it fits. It explains why cultures worldwide preserve the same pattern, why the numbers in the King List are so precise, why the post-flood section gradually transitions from mythic to historic proportions. It suggests that human civilization is not 5,000 years old, it's 50,000 years old or more, but it's discontinuous, rising and falling in cycles, each collapse erasing most of what came before, each rebuilding preserving a little more than the last. And if this is true, if we are the seventh civilization, then certain questions become urgent. What destroyed the first six? Are we approaching another collapse? And if so, what can we learn from those who came before us? Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of deep time. 50,000 years of human striving, building and losing and building again, each age leaving traces that the next age interprets as myth, until the traces are so fragmentary that we can barely see the pattern anymore. But the pattern is there, in clay tablets, in flood myths, in the identical structure of age theories across unrelated cultures. The pattern whispers, "This has happened before. You are not the first. Learn from those who came before you." Now we must speak of the flood itself, because if 6 civilizations rose and fell before Sumer, something ended them. Something catastrophic enough to break the chain of transmission so completely that the survivors could barely remember what had been lost. Every ancient culture has a flood myth. This is not an exaggeration. Over 200 distinct flood narratives have been documented by anthropologists, from every inhabited continent, from cultures that had no contact with each other. The oldest written version comes from Sumer, the Epic of Ziusudra, dating to around 1600 BCE, but based on much older oral traditions. Ziusudra, a pious king, receives warning from the god Enki that the Council of Gods has decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki tells him to build a boat. Ziusudra survives along with his family and animals. After 7 days and nights, the waters recede. The same story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the survivor is named Utnapishtim. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the hero is Atrahasis. Same warning, same boat, same survival, same rebuilding. These Mesopotamian versions appear to be source material for the biblical story of Noah, written down centuries later. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. The dimensions of the boat, the sending out of birds to find land, the sacrifice offered after the flood. But here's what should give us pause. The flood myths are global, not just regional. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by Vishnu in the form of a fish about a coming deluge. Manu builds a boat, survives, becomes the progenitor of the new human race. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds an ark and survives with his wife Pyrrha. They land on Mount Parnassus and repopulate the earth. In China, the story of Gun and Yu describes a great flood that covered the land. Yu the Great spends decades controlling the waters, digging channels, creating river systems to drain the flood. In Australia, various Aboriginal nations preserve flood stories. The Gai people tell of a time when the sea suddenly rose, flooding coastal areas where people had lived. In North America, the Ojibwe tell of a great flood sent to purge the world. A man named Wainabuju survives by floating on a log with various animals. In South America, the Inca preserves stories of a flood that destroyed earlier peoples. The creator god Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca after the flood to create a new world. Why? Why would cultures separated by oceans all tell versions of the same story? The standard explanation: floods are common. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike. Every culture experiences these things, so every culture develops flood mythology. But this doesn't account for the specificity. These aren't stories about bad floods. They're stories about the world ending and beginning again. Total destruction. One family survives. Civilization must be rebuilt from scratch. There are 2 main possibilities. First, they're cultural memories of an actual catastrophe. The most likely candidate is the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose dramatically. This wasn't sudden. It happened over centuries. But from the perspective of people living through it, watching coastlines disappear, watching islands sink, watching valleys flood, it would have felt apocalyptic. And crucially, it was global. Every coastline on Earth was affected. Every river system changed. Every human population in lowland areas would have experienced catastrophic flooding. If any Ice Age civilizations existed along those coastlines, they were drowned. Their sites now lie under hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. The survivors would have passed down stories. Once we lived in a great land by the sea, then the waters came. We barely escaped. After generations of oral transmission, these become myths. The mechanism, gradual sea level rise, compresses into the flood came in 40 days. The timescale shifts, but the core remains. There was a time before, the waters came, we survived, we rebuilt. Second possibility, independent invention. Humans everywhere experience trauma from floods. Our brains encode trauma in story. We create narratives that explain suffering and give meaning to catastrophe. So independently, in different regions, people created similar flood myths because they're psychologically satisfying. They explain why the world is imperfect. They provide a mechanism for cosmic renewal. Both explanations are plausible. Perhaps both are partially true. Perhaps some flood myths stem from actual Ice Age memories, while others are later inventions borrowing a resonant structure. But there's a third possibility, more unsettling. What if the flood myths remember not one catastrophe but many? What if catastrophic resets are the norm, not the exception? What if every few thousand years something happens? Climate shift, supervolcano, asteroid impact, disease, war. Something that collapses whatever civilization has built itself up. And each time, survivors tell the story. Each time, the details change, but the pattern remains. There was a golden age, catastrophe struck, we survived, we rebuilt. If this is true, we're not remembering one Ice Age flood. We're remembering a cycle. The sixth civilization was destroyed by flood, the fifth by fire, the fourth by disease, the third by war. Each catastrophe different in mechanism but similar in result. Total collapse, scattered survivors, fragmented knowledge, mythologized memory. The Sumerian King List, read this way, becomes a chronicle of these cycles. 6 civilizations, 6 catastrophes, compressed into 8 symbolic rulers whose combined reigns span 250,000 years. Not literal time, but deep time, geological time, the time scale on which continents drift and ice ages come and go and human societies rise and fall like tides. Then the flood swept over. Not one flood, but the most recent collapse. The one closest to living memory. The one that destroyed the 6th civilization so completely that when the 7th civilization emerged, they could barely reconstruct what had been lost. Let these ideas settle like silt after a flood. You don't need to believe any of this. Just hold the possibility that history is deeper than we know, that we are not the first to rise, that those who came before us tried to warn us through the only medium that survives catastrophe, story, myth, sacred numbers pressed into clay. Breathe slowly. Feel yourself sinking deeper into that liminal space between waking and dreaming where impossible ideas become possible, where the boundaries of the known world grow soft. Now we must examine the physical evidence, because if 6 civilizations rose and fell before Sumer, they should have left traces. Faint traces, perhaps, ambiguous traces, but traces nonetheless. The problem is time. After 10,000 years, very little remains. Wood rots, cloth disintegrates, leather decays, bone turns to dust, even stone crumbles. If there was a sophisticated civilization 30,000 years ago, we would find almost no trace unless they built massively in stone. And even then we might mistake their ruins for natural formations. Consider what would remain of our civilization after 30,000 years. Concrete contains steel reinforcement. When the steel rusts, it expands, cracking the concrete. Within a few centuries, most modern buildings would collapse. Within a few millennia, they'd be reduced to irregular mounds easily mistaken for hills. Plastics might survive longest, but they'd be scattered, fragmentary, unrecognizable as artifacts of advanced technology. Future archaeologists might find them and assume they were natural mineral deposits. The clearest evidence would be in the geological record, a thin layer of unusual materials, high concentrations, of certain metals, evidence of massive mining operations, changed river courses, agricultural modifications to landscape. But even these traces fade. River valleys fill with sediment. Forests reclaim cleared land. Mountains erode. The Earth has a way of erasing the works of man given enough time, so if we're looking for evidence of pre-Sumerian civilizations, we need to know where to look and what we're looking for. First, look underwater. Sea levels were 300 feet lower during the Ice Age. The coastlines where Ice Age humans would have settled are now drowned. Underwater archaeology is discovering more every year. stone structures off the coast of India, anomalies off the coast of Cuba, formations in the Mediterranean that some researchers interpret as artificial. These discoveries are controversial. Most are explained as natural geology, but some defy easy explanation. Right angles in nature are rare, parallel grooves suggesting tool marks, arrangements that seem too regular to be coincidental. The debate continues, but the fact that we're finding anything at all suggests that much more lies hidden beneath the waves. Entire landscapes, entire settlement patterns, perhaps entire cities built by Ice Age peoples who were more sophisticated than we've assumed. Second, look at megalithic sites that predate recorded history. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous, but it's not alone. Across the world, massive stone structures exist that archaeology struggles to explain. The temples of Malta, dating to 3600 BCE. Massive limestone blocks fitted together with sophisticated joinery, carved with spiral patterns and animal reliefs, built by a culture we know almost nothing about. They left no writing, their language is lost, but they built structures that have survived 5,000 years. The megalithic sites of Karnak in Brittany, thousands of standing stones arranged in precise rows stretching for miles, erected around 4500 BCE. Why? We don't know. The culture that built them left no records, but they clearly had sophisticated understanding of astronomy, geometry, and massive labour organisation. The stone circles of Britain. Stonehenge is famous, but over 1,000 stone circles dot the British landscape, most predating Stonehenge, built between 3000 and 2000 BCE, each one precisely aligned to solar or lunar events, each one representing enormous communal effort. These megalithic cultures appear suddenly in the archaeological record. They build in stone with sophistication that suggests prior experience, but we find no earlier, simpler versions, no prototype stone circles, no failed experiments. It's as if the knowledge of megalithic construction appeared fully formed, not invented but remembered, not discovered but recovered from older traditions. Third, look at the oldest layers of known ancient sites. Many cities have been continuously occupied for thousands of years, each generation building on the ruins of the last. When archaeologists excavate these tells, these artificial mounds, they find layer after layer of occupation stretching back into prehistory. At Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, 17 temples have been excavated, each built directly on top of the previous one. The lowest temple dates to around 5400 BCE, over 1,000 years before Sumer as we know it emerged. And beneath that temple, archaeologists found evidence of still earlier occupation, simple dwellings, pottery, signs of settled life extending back to 5800 BCE or earlier. But here's what's strange. Even the earliest temple at Eridu shows architectural sophistication, a rectangular shrine, an altar platform, niches for offerings, careful orientation. This wasn't experimental construction. Someone already knew how to build sacred space. Where did they learn? At Jericho in the Jordan Valley, excavations have revealed settlement layers dating back to 9600 BCE. Stone walls, tower structures, plastered floors. This is before the development of agriculture in the region, before pottery, before any of the markers we associate with civilization. Yet someone was building in stone, creating permanent settlements, organising labour, planning for defence. Who were they? What did they know? Where did their knowledge come from? The standard answer is independent development. Humans are clever. Given enough time, we figure things out. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy. We invented these things through trial and error. But the archaeological record shows remarkably little trial and error. Technologies appear suddenly, fully formed. Writing in Sumer, megalithic construction in Europe, advanced astronomy in multiple locations. It's possible this is sampling bias. We've only excavated a tiny fraction of ancient sites. The experimental phases might lie undiscovered, but it's also possible that knowledge was being transmitted, not invented fresh by each culture, but inherited from earlier sources, passed down, through oral tradition, recovered from fragmentary texts, remembered from the time before the flood. If 6 civilizations rose and fell before Sumer, their knowledge wouldn't be entirely lost. Survivors would carry fragments. Techniques would be half remembered. Stories would preserve principles even when the details were forgotten. The seventh civilization, emerging from the ruins, would build on these fragments. They'd start higher than the sixth civilization had started, because they had the sixth ruins to study. And the sixth had stood on the fifth's shoulders, and so on back through the cycles. This would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge. Not invented, but recovered. Not created from scratch, but assembled from inherited pieces. And it would explain why ancient cultures themselves insisted they were not the first. The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven. The Egyptians said the gods taught them. The Maya said the feathered serpent brought knowledge. They were all saying the same thing. We didn't invent this, we received it. Perhaps they were telling the truth. Not literal gods from the sky, but knowledge from the past, from the civilizations that came before, from the 6 ages that rose and fell before the 7th began. Your breathing has slowed, your thoughts drift like clouds. Let this possibility rest in your mind without judgment. 6 civilizations before ours, 6 cycles of rise and fall, each one leaving traces that we've learned to interpret as myth rather than memory. Now we must ask the harder question. If 6 civilizations fell, what destroyed them? And are we approaching the same fate? The Earth is not stable. It's dynamic, violent on geological timescales, capable of reshaping itself in ways that make human civilization seem as temporary as morning frost. Consider the Toba super-eruption approximately 74,000 years ago. Mount Toba in Sumatra exploded with a force equivalent to several 1,000 nuclear weapons. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere. The volcanic winter that followed may have lasted 6 to 10 years. Global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Genetic studies suggest the human population may have crashed to as few as 3 to 10,000 breeding individuals worldwide. If humans had developed any sophisticated cultures before Toba, complex societies, early settlements, proto-cities, they would have been obliterated. The survivors scattered in small bands would have had to rebuild from basic survival, and all memory of what came before would become myth. Compressed into stories, once our ancestors lived in plenty, then the sky darkened and winter never ended. Only a few families survived. Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, long before any civilization we recognize. But supervolcanoes erupt on cycles measured in hundreds of thousands of years. Yellowstone erupts roughly every 600,000 years. The last eruption was 640,000 years ago. We're not overdue yet, but we're approaching another cycle. If Yellowstone erupted tomorrow with the force of its previous eruptions, it would bury much of North America under feet of ash. Crops would fail worldwide. The ash cloud would circle the globe within weeks, dimming sunlight, dropping temperatures. Modern civilization, with its global supply chains, its dependence on industrial agriculture, its concentrated populations in cities, would be more vulnerable to catastrophic disruption than any previous society. Within months, food shortages would trigger conflicts, power grids would fail, the internet would collapse, and after a few generations of volcanic winter, the survivors scattered in isolated communities would tell their children stories about the before times, when machines flew through the air, when food came from stores, when humans could speak across distances through glowing screens. And their children would tell their children. And after 10 generations, 20, the stories would shift. The flying machines would become metal birds, the glowing screens would become seeing stones. The old world would become a golden age when gods walked among men. Eventually someone would write it down, and someone else would read it thousands of years later and say, "These are myths, exaggerations, impossible." They didn't mean these things literally, but they did. And we would have lost another cycle. This is how knowledge erodes, not all at once in a dramatic burning of libraries, but gradually through disruption, through generational drift, through the simple fact that oral tradition distorts over time. Supervolcanoes are one mechanism of collapse, but there are others, climate shifts. The Earth's climate oscillates between ice ages and interglacial periods on cycles of roughly 100,000 years. We're currently in an interglacial called the Holocene, which has lasted 11,700 years. But the Holocene won't last forever. At some point, perhaps thousands of years from now, perhaps sooner if we've disrupted the climate system beyond recovery, the ice will return. Or the opposite might happen. runaway warming making large parts of Earth uninhabitable. Either scenario would force massive human migration, climate refugees by the billions, competition for remaining habitable land, wars, famines, plagues following weakened populations. Civilizations have collapsed from climate shifts far less dramatic. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE coincided with drought in the eastern Mediterranean. The classic Maya collapse around 900 CE corresponded with extended drought in the Yucatan. The Western Roman Empire disintegrated gradually over centuries, but the collapse accelerated during a period of climate instability between 400 and 600 CE. Cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons, crop failures. The empire's ability to feed its armies and cities deteriorated. Barbarian migrations increased as peoples on the northern periphery sought warmer, more productive lands. The infrastructure crumbled, the cities emptied, and within a few generations, literacy rates in Western Europe plummeted from perhaps 30% to under 5%. This wasn't a supervolcano. This wasn't an asteroid. This was just climate wobbling by a few degrees for a few decades, and it was enough to collapse the most sophisticated administrative system the Western world had yet produced. Imagine what a real catastrophe would do. Asteroid impacts. We know they happen. The dinosaurs didn't survive the last major one to 66 million years ago, but smaller impacts occur more frequently. An asteroid large enough to devastate a continent strikes Earth roughly every few 100,000 years. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened 800 square miles of Siberian forest. If it had struck Moscow or London, millions would have died, and Tunguska was tiny compared to what geology tells us has hit Earth in the past. The Chicxulub crater in Mexico, the Vredefort crater in South Africa, the Sudbury Basin in Canada. Evidence of cosmic collisions powerful enough to reshape continents. If one of those strikes happened tomorrow, human civilization would end. Not humanity necessarily, we're adaptable, but civilization. The cities, the governments, the global networks that keep billions alive, the survivors would scatter, and within generations the stories would begin. Once we lived in great cities, then fire fell from the sky. The world burned. Only a few families escaped to the mountains, and their descendants 10,000 years later would read these stories and say, interesting myths, but obviously exaggerated. The ancients didn't understand natural disasters, so they encoded them as divine punishment. But they weren't exaggerating. They were remembering plagues. Diseases ended more civilizations than war. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe's population in the 14th century. The population didn't recover for 200 years. The Justinianic plague in 541 CE killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, devastating the Byzantine Empire just as it was attempting to reunite the Roman world. The Antonine Plague in 165 CE may have killed 5 million people across the Roman Empire, contributing to the crisis of the 3rd century. We've been lucky recently. Modern medicine, antibiotics, vaccines. These have given us temporary immunity to the cycles of plague that haunted our ancestors, but antibiotic resistance is increasing. New diseases emerge from animal reservoirs, just like COVID-19. The infrastructure that protects us is fragile, dependent on global supply chains, on functioning economies, on social stability. If a plague with the transmissibility of measles and the lethality of Ebola emerged, something evolution is perfectly capable of producing. Our interconnected world would amplify the catastrophe rather than contain it. Air travel would spread it globally within days. Hospitals would be overwhelmed within weeks. Governments would collapse as personnel died or fled. Within months we'd be back to isolated communities, avoiding strangers, burning the dead, praying to gods we'd half forgotten. And the stories would begin again. War. Total war with modern weapons. We came very close during the Cold War. Nuclear arsenals large enough to obliterate every major city multiple times over. Launch protocols that allowed single individuals to initiate Armageddon. We avoided it. Barely. Through luck as much as wisdom. But the weapons still exist. And every few decades, tensions rise to the point where someone, somewhere, considers using them. If nuclear war happened tomorrow, the immediate casualties would be catastrophic. But the real damage would come from what follows. Nuclear winter, ash and debris blocking sunlight for years, global temperatures dropping, crops failing. Worldwide, even areas untouched by bombs would starve as the agricultural system collapsed. The survivors would be scattered bands in remote regions, far from blast zones, far from radioactive fallout, and they would tell stories. Once our ancestors commanded the power of the sun itself. They could destroy cities with single weapons, but they were foolish. They used this power against each other. The world burned. Only we survived because our ancestors fled to the mountains before the fire came. Their descendants wouldn't believe them. 10,000 years later, archaeologists would excavate the ruins of New York or Beijing and find melted glass in the foundations. They'd find radiation signatures. They'd find collapsed skyscrapers whose steel had melted, and they'd say, catastrophic fire, probably volcanic. These ancient peoples built in easily flammable materials. Their cities burned. They lacked our sophisticated fire suppression systems. They wouldn't believe the people destroyed themselves. It would seem too irrational, too impossible. Surely no civilization would deliberately erase itself. But we came within minutes of doing exactly that. Multiple times. During the Cuban Missile Crisis. During false alarm incidents when Soviet or American systems detected launches that weren't real. Each time, someone made the choice not to retaliate, to wait, to verify. But someday, someone might not wait. Or the weapons might be used deliberately, in desperation, in rage, in the belief that if my civilization is ending, everyone's should end. This is the fragility we don't like to acknowledge. Modern civilization is incredibly sophisticated, but also incredibly vulnerable. We've built elaborate systems that require constant maintenance, power grids, water treatment, food distribution, communication networks. If those systems fail, if the specialists who maintain them die or disappear, the whole structure collapses rapidly, and rebuilding takes generations, especially if we've lost the knowledge of how these systems worked. This is the pattern the ancient myths are warning us about. Not that gods arbitrarily destroy the world, but that civilizations destroy themselves, through hubris, through short-sightedness, through the accumulation of stresses that eventually exceed the system's capacity to absorb them. And each time, the survivors build again. They rise from the ashes. They create new cities, new laws, new stories. They carry fragments of what came before, distorted by time but containing threads of truth. This is what the Sumerian King List might actually be documenting. Not 8 literal kings who lived impossibly long lives, but 6 complete cycles of civilization rising and falling across deep time, each one leaving traces, each one teaching the next, through myth and oral tradition, the dangers of forgetting that this has happened before. We are the 7th civilization, and we're approaching the same thresholds that destroyed the previous 6. Environmental collapse. We've altered the climate faster than at any point in human history. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event. Species are disappearing at rates not seen since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Resource depletion. We've extracted easily accessible metals, minerals, fossil fuels. Future civilizations rebuilding after a collapse won't have access to the surface coal, the shallow oil, the concentrated ore deposits. They'll have to start with degraded resources, making the climb back to industrial civilization far more difficult. Nuclear waste. We've created radioactive materials that will remain deadly for thousands of years. We've stored them in facilities that require constant monitoring. If civilization collapses, those facilities will be abandoned. The waste will leak into groundwater. Future people settling in these areas won't understand the danger until they're already poisoned. Microplastics. We've saturated the environment with persistent polymers that don't break down. They're in the soil, in the oceans, in our own bodies. We don't yet understand the long-term consequences, but early research suggests they disrupt hormones, reduce fertility, accumulate in organs, antibiotic resistance. We've overused the miracle drugs that saved us from bacterial diseases. Resistance is spreading. Within decades, we might face infections we can't treat. Surgery becomes deadly again. Childbirth becomes dangerous. Simple cuts become life-threatening. Each of these is manageable in isolation, but they're not isolated. They're interconnected. Climate change drives migration, which increases conflict, which disrupts supply chains, which makes resource scarcity worse, which triggers more conflict. Systems under stress don't fail linearly. They fail suddenly. After absorbing pressure for years, decades, they reach a threshold and collapse all at once. The Maya didn't decline gradually. Their cities were abandoned within a generation. The Bronze Age powers didn't slowly fade. They fell within decades across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Rome didn't shrink predictably. It fragmented suddenly after centuries of apparent stability. We see the pattern throughout history. Civilizations appear robust until they're not, and once the collapse begins, it accelerates. Are we in the late stages of the seventh civilization? Are we approaching the flood that will sweep over, reset the clock, scatter the survivors, and leave the next cycle to rebuild from our ruins? The myths suggest this is inevitable. The yugas always decline from gold to silver to bronze to iron. The ages of man always move from better to worse. The floods always come. But the myths also suggest something else. That knowledge can be preserved, that wisdom can be transmitted, that the survivors of one cycle can help the next cycle rise faster, climb higher, avoid some of the mistakes that destroyed the previous age. This is what the ancient scribes were trying to do, pressing words into clay, building in stone, encoding mathematics into architecture, creating messages that would survive catastrophe and speak to whoever came after. They were building time capsules, not for their own generation, but for the distant future. For us, for the seventh civilization, warning us that we are not the first, reminding us that this has happened before, begging us to learn from their mistakes so we don't repeat them. Let yourself feel the weight of this, the depth of time, the recurring pattern of rise and fall, the fragility of everything we've built, the urgency of the warning carried forward through 50,000 years of human struggle. You're in that liminal space now, between waking and sleeping, between belief and skepticism, between the official story and the deeper pattern. Stay here a while. Let these thoughts move through you like water through stone, slow, patient, wearing away certainty. Whether you believe any of this tomorrow doesn't matter. What matters is that tonight, in this moment, you've touched something older than history, a pattern that repeats, a cycle that continues, a warning pressed into clay by people who knew what was coming because they'd seen it before. Now we must examine what the Sumerians actually said about who ruled before them, because if we're reading the King List correctly, if those antediluvian rulers represent entire civilizations rather than individuals, then the question becomes, who were they? The texts call them Anunnaki. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki are described as the great gods who came from the sky. They're not quite like the gods of later Greek or Roman mythology. They're more bureaucratic, more administrative. They have specific jobs, they govern specific cities, they make decisions in councils. The word Anunnaki breaks down linguistically to something like those who from heaven to earth came. Not born on earth, not emerging from primordial chaos, came from somewhere else. Now most scholars interpret this as theological poetry, heaven as the divine realm, the gods descending metaphorically to establish order among humans. But read literally, the term suggests something different. Beings who arrived from outside, who established governance, who taught humans agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, who ruled until the flood came, then withdrew, leaving humanity to govern itself. What if the Anunnaki are cultural memory of those previous civilizations? Not alien gods from the sky, but the survivors and inheritors of earlier cycles, the people who carried forward fragments of ancient knowledge, who appeared to the emerging seventh civilization as impossibly wise because they retained techniques the flood had otherwise erased. Imagine you're living in 9000 BCE. Your people are hunter-gatherers. You know plants, animals, the rhythms of seasons. But you don't build permanent settlements, you don't farm, you don't write, then strangers arrive. Survivors from coastal cities that were drowned when the ice melted. They know things you don't. They understand astronomy well enough to predict eclipses. They have techniques for domesticating plants. They can smelt copper. They have stories about great cities that existed before the waters came. To you they would seem like gods, not because they claim divinity, but because their knowledge is so far beyond yours that you have no framework for understanding them as simply more advanced humans. So you remember them as the Anunnaki. Those who came from heaven, meaning from somewhere else, somewhere you don't understand. They taught you, they ruled you, and eventually they departed, leaving you to maintain what they'd established. This interpretation transforms the Sumerian texts from mythology into distorted history. The Anunnaki were real people, survivors of the sixth civilization, carrying forward knowledge from the fifth, fourth, third, second, first. They established the earlier settlements at Eridu. They taught the astronomical observations that the Sumerians preserved in their tablets. They designed the first temples according to geometric principles they'd inherited from their ancestors. And when the seventh civilization emerged fully, when the Sumerians coalesced into a recognizable culture around 3500 BCE, the Anunnaki had become myth, their real nature forgotten, their knowledge preserved but no longer understood. Attributed to gods because the alternative, that earlier humans had achieved these things and lost them, was too painful to remember clearly. The King List preserves this transition. The antediluvian rulers are Anunnaki, divine figures with impossibly long reigns, representing the previous 6 civilizations compressed into symbolic form. After the flood, kingship descends again, but now it's human kingship. The Anunnaki have withdrawn. Humanity governs itself, guided by fragmentary memories of what came before. This reading makes the entire Sumerian corpus more coherent. The texts aren't mixing history and mythology randomly. They're trying to preserve a true pattern, that human civilization is cyclical, that knowledge is inherited from earlier ages, that we are the latest in a series of attempts to build lasting culture. And they're warning us, because they knew, through their inherited memories of 6 previous collapses, that it would happen again. The flood would return, not literally the same flood, but catastrophe, reset, the loss of almost everything, survivors scattered, knowledge fragmenting into myth. They tried to prevent total loss by encoding crucial information in the most durable formats they could devise. Clay tablets fired hard, stone monuments, mathematical ratios embedded in architecture, sacred numbers preserved in religious texts. They were building ark, not of wood to survive water, but of information to survive time. Did it work? Partially. We've recovered fragments. We can read there. Cuneiform. We've excavated their cities. We've translated their mathematics and confirmed their astronomical observations were accurate. But the core message, the warning itself, has been dismissed as mythology. We've extracted the data while ignoring the meta-message encoded in how that data is presented. The message is this: you're not the first. This has happened before, 6 times before. Learn from those who came before you. Build systems that can survive catastrophe. Preserve knowledge in forms that will outlast your civilization, because the cycle will continue, the flood will come again. And what you do now determines how much the 8th civilization will have to work with when they rise from your ruins. This is why the antediluvian section of the King List uses such precise numbers. 28,800 years, 36,000 years. These aren't random figures. They're symbolic markers. Sacred numbers meant to be preserved exactly, copied without alteration, maintained across generations. Even if later scribes no longer understood what the numbers represented, they knew these figures were important. They copied them faithfully from older tablets. They checked and rechecked for accuracy. Because something in their cultural DNA told them these numbers carried weight beyond mere chronicle. Modern numerology dismisses this as superstition. But what if it's the opposite? What if precise numerical preservation was the only way to maintain accurate information across catastrophic breaks in transmission? If you know a climate cycle repeats every 25,120 years, the precession of the equinoxes, but you have no writing system and your culture is about to collapse, how do you preserve this knowledge? You encode it in myth. You make it sacred. You attach it to religious practices that will be maintained through oral tradition. You break it down into smaller ratios that can be memorized and passed down through songs, rituals, architectural, proportions. The number becomes sacred not because it's mystical, but because it's data, critical data that must not be lost. The Sumerian King List's antediluvian numbers might function the same way, not literal reign lengths, but encoded information about cycle durations, about how long each previous civilization lasted, about patterns in climate shifts or asteroid impacts, or whatever mechanisms repeatedly reset human progress. 28,800 years might represent the average duration of a civilization cycle, from emergence to collapse, the time it takes for a human society to rise from scattered bands to sophisticated culture, and then overextend, deplete resources, and fall. If this pattern repeats, if it's driven by something consistent like climatic cycles, or cosmic debris streams Earth periodically passes through, then knowing the cycle length is crucial. It tells you how much time you have, when to start preparing for the next collapse. The ancient scribes were giving us a timeline, not for divination, but for preparation. They were saying, we have X thousand years. Use them wisely. Build systems that can survive the coming storm. Don't make the mistakes we made, the mistakes the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth civilizations made. We ignored them. We dismissed their warnings as myths. We built the same fragile systems that collapsed before. We've created the same dependencies that make catastrophe catastrophic rather than manageable, and now we're approaching the end of our cycle. The seventh civilization has reached its peak. The climate is destabilizing. The resources are depleting. The systems are stressed beyond recovery. The flood is coming. Not water this time, fire perhaps, plague, war, or slow grinding collapse as ecosystems fail and food systems break down. When it arrives, some will survive. They always do. Humans are remarkably resilient. We've survived ice ages, supervolcanoes, megadroughts, plagues that killed most of us. We'll survive this too. But we'll lose most of what we've built, most of what we know, most of our history, and the survivors will tell stories about the before times when humans could fly through the air, when knowledge was stored in invisible places you could access with glowing rectangles, when food came from vast networks that spanned the whole world, and their grandchildren will tell their grandchildren, and the stories will shift. The airplanes will become metal birds. The internet will become a web woven by gods. The global supply chains will become a golden age when the earth provided abundantly without labour. 10,000 years later, the eighth civilization will excavate our ruins. They'll find concrete and steel turned to rust and dust. They'll find plastic fragments they can't identify. They'll find radiation signatures they don't understand, and they'll write their own king list, recording the rulers of their civilization, and before that the semi-mythical founders, and before that, in an antediluvian section they half believe and half doubt, they'll record that before their civilization there was another, us, the seventh civilization, whose ruins lie beneath the forests that reclaimed our cities, whose knowledge is preserved in fragments they can barely translate, whose warnings they've encoded in their own sacred texts, trying to pass forward the same message the Sumerians tried to pass to us. This has happened before. You are not the first. Learn from those who came before so you don't repeat their mistakes. Will they listen? Probably not. We didn't. But they'll try. The survivors always try. Because buried deep in human consciousness is the knowledge that we've been here before, that the cycles repeat, that rise and fall are as natural as day and night, as inevitable as the seasons. The myths remember. Even when we forget, the myths remember. Your breathing has become very slow now. Deep. Rhythmic. You're hovering in that space between worlds, between past and future, between the seventh civilization and the eighth. Feel the continuity. Feel the pattern stretching back through 6 previous cycles and forward through uncounted cycles yet to come. We are not the pinnacle, we are not the end. We're just another iteration, another attempt, another civilization trying to build something that lasts. And like the 6 before us, we'll fail. The flood will come, in whatever form it takes, and we'll leave behind ruins and myths and numbers pressed into whatever medium we hope will survive. But failure isn't final. The pattern continues. The 8th civilization will rise, and the 9th, and the 10th, each one building on the ruins of the last, each one climbing a little higher because they stand on the shoulders of all who came before. This is the true meaning of the Sumerian King List. Not that kingship descended from heaven once and stayed, but that it descends repeatedly. Each time humanity falls, kingship returns, governance re-emerges, civilization rebuilds. The pattern is not ending, it's continuation. Rise and fall and rise again, forever. We are part of an old story. Older than Sumer, older than the pyramids, older than any monument we've yet discovered. We are the latest chapter in a book that has no final page. The current iteration in a cycle that preceded us and will continue long after we're gone. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of all. Not the idea that there were 6 civilizations before ours. Not even the idea that they collapsed. But the idea that collapse is not a rare accident in the story of intelligence. It might be the story. The rhythm beneath the melody. The tide that rises no matter what names we give the moon. Because if you allow yourself to imagine it, if you let the protective shell of modern certainty soften just a little, you begin to see how fragile our confidence really is. We stand on a thin crust of assumptions. We assume that Because we remember the last 5,000 years fairly well, nothing worth calling civilization existed before that. We assume that because we can map ruins with satellites and date bones with carbon, the deep past is empty of complex patterns. We assume that because we've named the eras behave – Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age – as if humanity marched forward in neat categories like chapters in a textbook. But history, real history, doesn't move in chapters. It moves like weather. It moves like the sea. It gathers pressure. It shifts. It breaks. It calms. And then it does it again. In the quiet of night, with the world outside your window reduced to distant hums and fading headlights, ask yourself something simple. If you could erase our cities with a slow-rising ocean, if you could drown our coastal megacities and turn their streets into reefs, what would remain for someone 10,000 years from now to find? A few inland ruins, some scattered foundations, a thin layer of strange material in the soil, a few pockets of metal protected by chance, and then the rest would be stories, half-remembered, ritualized, passed down like lullabies in languages not yet born. The ancients understood this instinctively, not as an abstract theory, as lived knowledge. They built in stone when they wanted something to last. They pressed into clay when they wanted something to survive fire and water. They carved into mountains when they wanted to speak to time itself. And if they truly believed the cycle would return, if they truly believed that the flood would come again in one form or another, then every temple becomes something more than worship. It becomes a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of centuries. Consider how carefully the Sumerians named their cities in that king list: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. These are not vague mythic places like the land of the gods. They are real locations rooted in Mesopotamian geography, places where archaeology has found occupation layers and artifacts and the slow, patient build-up of human life. And yet the list places them in a time before the flood, before the world changed, before the rules were rewritten. It's almost as if the scribes were trying to anchor the unbelievable to the believable, to say quietly, in the same voice they used for taxes and grain ledgers and temple inventories, this happened here, in places you can walk to, under the same sky you can see. And then there's Nineveh, that basement archive beneath the British Museum, the cold air, the catalogue numbers, the fragments no larger than your palm, the idea that the most dangerous messages are rarely written on grand monuments where they can be celebrated. They're written small, copied quietly, shelved and forgotten, until someone with patient hands and a stubborn mind fits the broken pieces together and realizes the story is not comforting. In Atrahasis, the gods are not poetic metaphors. They are administrators faced with a problem. Humans multiply, humans make noise, humans become, in the language of the text, too much, and so a decision is made, not in rage, not in divine thunder, in council, with discussion, with policy. First, they try to reduce the population with hardship, with famine, with plague, with drought. Methods that feel eerily familiar to any student of collapse. When that fails, when humanity persists and rebuilds and grows again, the decision becomes more permanent. They introduce limits. They set boundaries in biology itself. They shorten lifespans. They enforce mortality like a law that cannot be appealed. Now you can read this as myth. You can say it is simply the human fear of death projected onto a divine stage, and perhaps that's all it is. But the reason it lingers in the mind, the reason it refuses to dissolve like most myths do, is that it resembles something we know from our own world, not gods in the sky, but systems that govern quietly, not thunderbolts, but policies, not magic, but design. When a society collapses, it doesn't only lose buildings and books, it loses time, it loses continuity, it loses the generational bridge that carries knowledge safely across centuries. Skills become folklore, science becomes superstition, technology becomes myth. And the survivors, faced with the overwhelming weight of what's been lost, do something humans always do when reality is too big. They personify it. They give it faces. They call the unknown gods. They call the inheritors those who descended. They call the architects of the old world ones who came from above. Because how else do you explain the sudden appearance of knowledge that your own people did not develop? How do you explain a stranger who can predict the sky? Who can tell you when the river will rise? Who can shape metal? Who can measure the land and divide it and mark it with stakes? Who can build a temple that stands straight and true? To a mind without context, that is divine. To a culture without history, that is heaven touching earth. And yet, if you follow the thread far enough, you reach a point where the question changes. It stops being, did the Anunnaki exist? And becomes, what kind of the event would force humans to describe the past this way? Because no matter how you interpret the names, the structure remains. There was a before, there was a catastrophic reset, there is an after, and the after is smaller, shorter lived, less luminous, more fragile. A world where the memory of the before is preserved not in libraries but in chants and numbers and the shapes of stones. This is why those reign lengths matter. Not because we should take them at face value as biographies, but because they are markers of scale. They tell us that the Sumerians were thinking in spans of time that dwarf dynasties. They were thinking in terms of cycles, not reigns, ages, not years. 250,000 years is not a human political memory. It is a geological statement. It is the kind of number you reach when you are trying to speak about something that repeats beyond the lifespan of any single culture. And if you are trying to preserve a warning across that kind of time, you do not write it once and hope for the best. You embed it everywhere. You scatter it like seeds. You make it a myth so it will be told by fires. You make it a ritual so it will be repeated in temples. You make it a number so it can be copied exactly even by those who don't understand it. You make it sacred so no one dares to change it. This is the strange mercy of religion, not in its doctrines, but in its durability. Sacred traditions survive collapse precisely because they are not efficient. They are redundant. They repeat. They insist. They do not let go. A modern person might scoff at the idea of memorizing thousands of verses or repeating ceremonies year after year, generation after generation. But those repetitions are a technology, a storage medium, a way to carry fragile information through a world that keeps forgetting. Imagine for a moment that the previous civilization did not fall in a clean cinematic apocalypse. Imagine it fell the way real systems fall. First, a few harvests fail. Then trade routes become dangerous. Then governments tighten control. Then outbreaks spread. Then trust collapses. Then knowledge becomes localized. Specialists die. Infrastructure breaks. Each failure making the next more likely. The world doesn't end in one day. It ends in a long unraveling. And in the middle of that unraveling, some people see farther than others. Some people understand that they cannot save everything, that they cannot preserve a whole civilization in its full complexity. So they choose. They decide what is worth carrying forward. They choose the numbers that govern the sky. They choose the knowledge of agriculture. They choose the idea of law. They choose the warning that systems collapse when they grow too rigid. They choose the memory that there were cycles before. They choose the list of kings and the line that divides time like a knife. Then the flood swept over. Because perhaps the flood is not a literal wall of water in every retelling. Perhaps it is a label for the reset itself, the moment when continuity breaks so severely that everything on the other side feels like another world. And if that is true, then the flood is not behind us. It is ahead of us too. Not as prophecy, but as probability. The Earth has always contained mechanisms of reset. Ice, fire, disease, impact, drought, war. The only difference now is that we have built a civilization so interconnected that a shock in one part of the system can cascade into every other part. This is not pessimism. It is simply the architecture of complexity. The more tightly linked a system becomes, the more efficiently it can grow, and the more vulnerable it becomes to cascading failure. Our ancestors lived in small bands. If one valley flooded, another valley remained. If one village starved, another hunted. But when you build global supply chains that feed billions, you create a miracle that works beautifully until it doesn't. Then the failure is just as global as the network, and perhaps this is what the old stories were circling around. Not gods as literal beings, but the recognition that there are forces larger than any city, any empire, any proud declaration of permanence. Forces that reset the board whether we're ready or not. In this light, the Anunnaki become less like aliens and more like a metaphor for inheritance, the past visiting the present, old knowledge descending into new hands. The council becomes less like Olympus and more like a surviving elite trying to decide how to stabilize a shattered world. And the decision to shorten lifespans becomes symbolic of something we can understand. After catastrophe, life becomes harder. Diets worsen, disease spreads, violence increases. Lifespans do shorten, not by magic, by conditions, by stress, by loss of sanitation, medicine, stable food, predictable shelter. Mortality rises, infant survival drops. The world becomes small again. Human life becomes, once more, something that ends quickly. So the story says, they limited us. They made us mortal, because that is what it feels like. When you have glimpsed a world of abundance and then lost it, the new world feels cursed. It feels deliberately diminished. It feels like someone, somewhere, decided you weren't allowed to have what was once possible. This is the psychology of survivors. It is also the psychology of myths. Myth is how trauma speaks when it has no vocabulary for climate cycles or microbiology or tectonic drift. It turns catastrophe into intention. It turns collapse into a decision made by powerful beings. It gives the suffering a reason, because reason is easier to carry than randomness. And yet, even if the myth is only trauma, encoded in divine language, it still points to something real. Something happened. A break occurred. A before became an after. A golden age became a diminished age. The real question, then, is not whether the ancients were right in our modern sense. The real question is what they were trying to make sure we didn't forget. Because if you look around our world now, quietly, without panic, just with clear eyes, you can see the same ingredients that appear again and again in the stories of collapse: environmental stress, resource pressure, mass migration, polarization, fragile infrastructure, distrust, a sense that the old agreements no longer hold, a sense that something is changing faster than our institutions can adapt. Every civilization in its late stage tells itself a story of uniqueness. Rome believed it would last forever. The Maya built calendars that reached far into the future, as if time itself belonged to them. The imperial courts of China spoke of mandates that made their order feel cosmically protected. We tell ourselves a similar story, not with gods but with progress. We believe that because we have electricity and satellites and antibiotics, we have escaped the ancient pattern. But technology does not remove the pattern. It intensifies it. It allows a civilization to grow bigger, faster, and more complex. It allows it to extract more resources, alter more ecosystems, build higher and more brittle structures of dependence. Technology is a ladder, and ladders are wonderful, until the rung breaks. So perhaps the Sumerians, copying those ancient lines, were not just fascinated by deep time. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they had inherited enough memory to know that the cycle does not stop simply because you've built temples and cities. Perhaps they knew that even the most radiant age can be swept away, and that those who come after will stand among ruins and argue about what they mean. If you've ever walked through an abandoned place, an empty factory, a ruined castle, a derelict neighborhood, you know the feeling. The way silence has weight. The way the mind starts filling gaps with imagined voices. The way you can almost hear the life that used to be there. Now enlarge that feeling to a planetary scale. Imagine a future person walking through the remains of our age. A highway swallowed by forest. A city centre reduced to hills of rubble. An airport runway cracked and buried. A data centre full of dead machines, their purpose unreadable. A museum where the glass has long since shattered and the artifacts have been scattered by scavengers who had no reason to keep them intact. That future person will not see our world the way we see it. They will see hints, puzzles. They will invent stories to explain the puzzles because that is what humans do. And somewhere, perhaps, they will find a fragment, a tablet, a book sealed in a dry cave, a metal plate etched with warnings, a hard drive sealed in a vault that somehow survived. And they will read, and they will feel the same unsettling recognition we feel when we read the old myths. They will realize the past was not as simple as they were taught, that there was a before there before, that there were people who built high and fell hard, that they are not the first to stand on the edge of the same cliff. And perhaps that is the true purpose of all these stories, not to prove a literal chronology of 6 lost super-civilizations, but to keep alive the awareness that no age is immune, that the arc of progress is not guaranteed, that collapse is not a moral failure reserved for primitive peoples. It is a structural risk built into the nature of complex life on a restless planet. If you accept that, even gently, without fear, then the idea of the seventh civilization becomes something different. It becomes less like a conspiracy theory and more like a lens. A way of viewing history not as a straight road but as a spiral. A way of seeing that knowledge can be lost and found, that darkness can follow light, that human brilliance is ancient and recurring, not a one-time miracle that began in Sumer and climbed steadily upward. Because even within our own short recorded history, we can watch the spiral. We can see Roman concrete that outlasts modern concrete. We can see Greek mechanisms like the Antikythera device that remind us the ancient mind was more ingenious than we like to admit. We can see forgotten techniques of stone cutting, lost pigments, lost recipes for materials that modern science can replicate only with effort. We can see the repeated pattern of societies reaching a height, assuming permanence, and then fracturing under pressures they did not adapt to. So take the idea seriously, not as dogma, but as a meditation. What if there were 6 before us? What if there were not? Either way, what changes? The answer is the same. We are fragile, we are temporary, and we have a choice in how we respond to that. Truth. We can respond with denial, with arrogance, with the insistence that we are special, exempt, destined to continue forever. Or we can respond the way the ancient scribes responded, by trying to preserve what matters, by building with an awareness of time, by making redundancy sacred, by leaving messages in formats that do not rely on a functioning grid or a stable economy. It sounds strange, but in a way, the act of telling this story tonight is part of that same impulse. Because stories are also arcs, they float across eras, they survive in the minds of people who have nothing else. When paper burns and servers fail and monuments crumble, a story can still be carried by someone walking across a ruined landscape whispered to a child by firelight. And if you are still listening, if your eyes are heavy and your thoughts are slow, then you are participating in something ancient. You are receiving a thread, a pattern, a warning that has been passed from mouth to mouth, from tablet to tablet, from myth to myth, for longer than we can measure. Not because it is meant to frighten you, but because it is meant to humble you, to remind you that the present is not the only world that has ever existed, that the future will not belong to us simply because we want it to, that the Earth does not care about our timelines, and yet, paradoxically, the Earth keeps giving life another chance. The 8th civilization, if it comes, will not be our enemy. It will be our descendant. It will be human, in whatever form humanity takes after the next reset, and it will inherit not only our ruins but our choices, the toxins we leave behind, the seeds we preserve, the knowledge we encode in durable forms, the stories we tell that shape how they interpret the past. So if there is a single question worth holding as you drift towards sleep, it is this. What would you want them to know? Not our celebrity names, not our politics, not the noise, but the principles, the hard-won lessons, the understanding that systems can fail, that cooperation matters, that the biosphere is not a backdrop but the foundation, that arrogance is expensive, that resilience is sacred. If the Sumerians could reach across time, if the scribes who copied the King List could lean close and speak to us, perhaps they wouldn't spend long arguing about whether we read their numbers correctly. Perhaps they would simply say, "We tried to tell you. We tried to remind you that the cycle is real. We tried to leave you a map even if the ink smudged." And perhaps that is why the old stories feel so strangely alive. They are not dead myths. They are signals. Weak, distorted, but persistent. Like a lighthouse seen through fog. Like a drumbeat heard from far away. They are the past trying to communicate with the present about the shape of the future. Outside, the night continues. Somewhere water moves in darkness. Rivers sliding toward the sea. Oceans rising and falling with the pull of the moon. The same moon that watched the first villages form. The same moon that watched cities drown. The same moon that shone over Göbekli Tepe when its pillars were newly carved and the world was still young in a way we can barely imagine. And you, here, now, are part of the 7th civilization's dream. A brief flare of consciousness in a long chain of flares. A living mind holding a pattern that might outlast the buildings and wires and screens of this age. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the need to prove or disprove soften. Let the idea simply rest in you like a stone in the pocket. Heavy. Real. not because it is certain, but because it changes the way you look at time. We are the seventh civilization, or we are not. Either way, we are not the first to stand where we stand, and we will not be the last. So breathe, slowly, deeply. Let the world become quiet again. Let the clay tablets return to their shelves in the cool, dark archive. Let the flood line in the King List sit like a horizon in the mind. Then the flood swept over, a simple sentence, a dividing line, and perhaps that line is not only behind us, perhaps it is always somewhere ahead, moving toward us through time, as inevitable as winter after autumn. But if the cycle is real, then so is renewal. If collapse comes, then rebuilding follows. If darkness falls, then someone, somewhere, will light a fire and tell a story and begin again. And that, in the end, may be the strange comfort hidden inside the unsettling message. Not that the world is safe, not that progress is guaranteed, but that the human impulse to rise is older than any ruin, that even after the flood, kingship descends again. Governance returns, language returns, art returns, the desire to understand returns, the cycle continues, and as your thoughts drift, as the edges of the room soften and the night pulls you downward into sleep, hold on to one last image. A future hand brushing dust from a fragment, a future mind reading a line that survived, a future voice whispering to a child, "There were others before us. They built, they fell, they tried to warn us, and perhaps this time we will listen."